Okay, so this list did take a little longer to work on, but that's because there's so many deaths to cover in this one. So I am going to want to get right into it, but first, the rules do still stay the same as they were seasons 1 through 6. First off, this is a ranking of the brutality of the deaths, and in no way is a reflection of my views of the results. Secondly, the deaths must be confirmed, so no draws where all combatants survive will be counted. And finally, any deaths that's seen during the fight, even if it's a bystander, may appear on this list. And with that, we'll go ahead and start ranking Season 8 Death Battle Deaths. To start out this list, we have yet another AI death. Now, this battle does have 2 AI deaths, but I didn't count Lopez, since he was shown to still be alive even as a head. Sheila the Tank, though, was not so fortunate. Now, in the past, I've usually ranked AIs at the bottom, because unlike organics, they really can't feel pain in their death. Now, an argument could be made that Sheila has shown some sentience before, but her death was just so quick that it still takes any brutality away from it. This next one is a group death that I'm sure was done to save time as well as for comedy, but it still fits well within the RVB narrative. The deaths of Tex, Donut, Tucker, and Church are all quick ones, much like Sheila. Thanks to Caboose's help, the ricocheting bullet makes its way to all 4 of these members and gives them a quick and mostly painless end. Although technically wouldn't Church still be alive since he's an AI? Maybe I should have put his death down with Sheila's. And we're sticking around Blood Gulch for this next one. Sarge's death, which is led up to by a very long monologue, ends quickly from a transported grenade. Honestly, could put them all on the same rank, seeing as how quickly they all happen, just in different ways. So taking a break from the red versus blue deaths, we now have a death from the Booster Gold versus Cable fight, but it's not Cable's death. Much like the Vader versus Dr. Doom fight, we have another T-Rex. Unlike that one who gets its head chopped off, this one just ends up getting beat up by a bunch of Booster Golds. Other than the short scene that we see, it's hard to tell how brutal it gets, which is why it lands here. From Time Travelers to an Icy Stage, Gray's death is next, which is pretty simple. He gets frozen. And normally it's not the most pleasant way to go, which is why it ranks at number 27. But seeing as he's also a cryokinetic, it's hard to tell just how painful it actually was, which is why it doesn't make it any higher than this. And it's time to go back to Blood Gulch for our next death. Much like everyone else's, Griff's death is pretty quick, with his neck being snapped. Of course, that's after getting the crap beaten out of him by Tex, and a neck snap is a pretty brutal way to go. Of course, it doesn't help that his own sergeant was happy about it, but that's also not unexpected. And we finally finish up the RVB deaths, which this one was a little trickier for me to place. At first I couldn't tell whether or not the Warthog had landed on Simmons after being blasted out of the air, but I figured just being thrown from there and landing on your back was brutal enough. Certainly the worst of all the RVB deaths, complete with the signature death groan. So finally being done with RVB, we move on to a fight between 2 iconic supernatural heroes. And dying is bad enough. It's worse when you're possessed. Of course, this isn't the first death that has involved possession, but at least Danny had enough courtesy to leave Jake's body before finishing him. Danny quickly vaporizes him, and then sucks his ghost into the Fenton thermos. Moving on to Miles Morales versus Static. And much like the last fight, Static neutralizes Miles' ability to fight back. And with Miles defenseless, Static's able to use his electricity for a supercharged attack, completely disintegrating him. Now you may remember a couple seasons back, when Hulk's death was ranked number 1. Well, this time it wasn't so brutal, although Brawley did try going for the head. Now, the actions leading up to the initial death were a major headache. Probably doesn't faze these two as much, but still, bashing heads together up until vaporization is still a pretty crazy way to go. She-Ra's death is next, and starting off with a sword clash before being overpowered, she pretty much gets to see her death coming as Wonder Woman lunges in at full speed. She manages to make a cut so clean that the hair manages to stay intact? Huh. Well, Obi-Wan apparently had the high ground in this one. Much like She-Ra's death, this one also ends in a sword slice, with one difference that puts it higher. Just before the initial death, Obi-Wan uses the Force to basically destroy Kakashi's Sharingan eye. And it really doesn't look like it was that pleasant just before it being sliced in half. We also see it takes a moment for his body to fall, meaning he also has that moment to still feel the pain. And staying with the sliced in half deaths, we have Leo's next. He does try to stop Jason as he's lunging towards him, with no success. Of course, what puts this up higher is the fact that after their sword clash, he actually stabs into Leo just before his body is sliced in half. And then we have a spontaneous combustion. So now we finally make it to the second battle that has multiple deaths. And starting us out with this one is Billy Butcher. And even being this high, we are still continuing the trend of quick deaths, but his is still brutal all the same. Even with technically being the winner, Homelander just has to get the last word in, giving him a very crushing death. And sticking with the 7 battle royale, we have the Deep's death next, which really isn't that much different from Butcher's death. Unlike Butcher, who was the last to die, the Deep is the first one to go. And he also didn't even get the chance to do anything before A-Train decided to run him over. Okay, I lied. He did get to run his mouth first, then died. And we've now made it to the halfway mark where we get to talk about Starlight's death. Which it might be worth noting that the events leading up to her death literally start out with her having a laser clash with a baby, eventually leading to Butcher deciding to drop a building on her and Queen Maeve. Starlight then gets to see her impending doom coming, and unfortunately, while Queen Maeve may have survived, she did not. Now we finally move into some of the deaths that don't happen quite as quick, although this one may have taken not as quick a little too literal. Having to have missed her shots at Spider-Gwen, Batgirl is then pulled in by her own grappling hook. Gwen then extends her claws, ripping through the jugular of Batgirl. Now I'm pretty sure she had died instantly, or she may have had a few moments to where she felt that. The constant camera slowdowns kinda made that confusing. Okay, now we made it to one that actually has a little bit more happening to the death. Of course, it is one thing to be killed off by your opponent, It's a whole different story when you're partially responsible for it. Having a hole lasered through his chest, he decided he wanted to go and take Rhodey with him and self-destruct. Unfortunately, this backfires, leaving Genos as only a head. Blowing yourself up is brutal enough. Having to end up being just a head and getting stepped on just makes it worse. So before I run through this one, definitely very appreciated seeing Dante Bosco voice Zuko. Now as far as the death goes, it was rough, buddy. Zuko at first seemed like he could gain the upper hand, but Shoto had decided to go all out, pinning him against an ice wall with ice. Of course, this didn't leave Zuko completely defenseless, as he was able to firebend from his mouth. Unfortunately for Zuko, Shoto's ice was able to cut through the flames, impaling him. Of course, the person to still feel most bad for would be the cabbage merchant. I wonder what this does for his insurance. So back to the Battle Royale, and Queen Maeve may have survived the falling building, but had no such luck, going against Butcher with a baby. It's bad enough to say you were killed by a baby. Worse to say that that baby lasered you into literal pieces. I promise you we are almost done with the 7 Battle Royale deaths, as we come just before the top 10. And for A-Train, his death was anything but pleasant. Summoning as much power as she could, Starlight managed to blast him in the eyes, basically blinding him. For a speedster, no sight can be dangerous, especially running at Queen Maeve, who literally knocks his head off. Or more accurately, the entire top half of his body. We finally make it to the top 10, starting out with the screaming match between Black Canary and Sindel. A battle that could have ended very poorly for Black Canary had she not saved herself at the last second. The same cannot be said for Sindel, who, before letting out a scream, was punched through the face and head ripped off. Can even be seen that a moment after the punch is delivered, that Black Canary pauses before pushing her fist all the way through Sindel's skull. And this gives Sindel the chance to experience her death as it's happening. Yet wasn't quite done with this one yet. There is one more death to go over, and it's bad enough when you're actually involved in the fight. It's even worse when you're just an innocent bystander, minding your own business. Next minute, your skin's on fire, just before you fall to your death. Next, we move on to the death of Venom, or Venom and Eddie. And after an aerial battle between the two, Venom is finally brought down. Now, a sonic blast can do some damage to just about anyone, but it's even worse for a symbiote. Now, this is one of the things that actually puts it up this high, considering that the initial death is actually a pretty quick vaporization. So that, along with Venom being hit by one of his greatest weaknesses, add in the fact that Ragnarok eats their souls, makes a pretty brutal end. Okay, so this is one that certainly had its uniqueness to it, and I'm talking about more than just the handsome Squidward reference. Some could have even thought that after Sanji's leg had literally exploded, that Lee probably would have had this. But then again, he was already dying once he opened up the 8th gate anyway. Sanji's next attack certainly didn't help Lee in any way, and then there's the promise of making him cough up his food. With one last powerful kick, he manages to rip Lee in half before he turns to ash. We now move on to the number 6 spot with their second live action battle. And yes, we do also get back to what is essentially a quick death, but I still feel it earns its spot here just simply by the type of death that it is. With Jason not only having his skull crushed in, but the helmet crushed in on it as well. And now we race into the top 5 with Sonic's death starting us off. And while at first it may have seemed as though Sonic could have had the upper hand, Wally eventually speeds his way through reality. Emerging back to the battle, Wally delivers an infinite mass punch, and while it really can't be gauged how painful that kind of distortion is, Sonic's scream is still a bit haunting. So for number 4, you could kind of think of it like a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where your opponent gives you one of their cards, but instead of helping, it does more harm. That's pretty much how this death is. Booster Gold takes off his force field, but instead of it deactivating, he actually gives it to Cable. What happens next can kind of remind you of the box prison from off of Loki. Cable struggles with walking before very violently being crushed. We finally make it into our top 3, and sometimes just getting pounded to death is more brutal than being blown up or sliced, especially if your limbs are also being ripped off. And Machamp does not hold back when he's disarming Goro. The amount of punishment Goro takes in this fight definitely lands it higher than any other death that has come before, all ending with him being punched into pieces, with only 2 deaths that I feel were worse than his. The beginning of this fight was already a gruesome scene, and while we don't get to see the deaths of these mutilated victims, it's implied that it was not pleasant. Becoming food doesn't make it any better, but at least there was an air of remorse for what he had done. Finally, we reach number 1 most brutal death of Season 7, and quite possibly the most bloodiest and most brutal of all of death battles in this Halloween episode. Fitting for what today is, seeing entrails and blood flying around, even to the point that Saberwolf tries to choke John with his own intestines. Of course, doesn't really work, and Saberwolf only ends up getting himself burned. Literally. What comes next is the most horrific sight that even Saberwolf tries to escape from, and being dragged back, we have a scene straight out of a classic horror movie as John tears Saberwolf apart. And that is my list for Season 7's most brutal deaths. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to like and please subscribe. And also hit the bell and check out some of my other content. And until next time, keep gaming.